step into the ancient labyrinthine corridors of Jerusalem, where the gripping tale of Caiaphas, the high priest who played a pivotal role in the death of Jesus Christ, unfolds. Joseph ben Caiaphas, as he was known, wielded immense religious and political power from 18 to 36 AD under the ever-watchful Roman governor Pontius Pilate. But behind his robes of authority and his position of influence, a darker story lurks, a story woven deep into the fabric of the New Testament. This isn't just another account of an ancient leader. This is a drama that reaches to the very heart of Christianity. Caiaphas emerges at the center of the gospel narratives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where he is forever linked to the condemnation of the innocent Jesus Christ. But what drove this high priest to such lengths? What motivated him to be the architect of a false trial, to weave a web of lies and condemn a man he knew was innocent? These are questions that echo through history, demanding answers. The plot thickens as we uncover even more unsettling truths. Caiaphas conducted a trial within the confines of his own residence, a trial that violated the sacred traditions of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was supposed to be composed of 71 members, yet Caiaphas deliberately gathered far fewer, casting aside the very laws that governed the trial process. Why did he so openly flout tradition and force a hasty, secretive judgment? What was the reason behind the rush to judgment when the required legal procedures were clearly ignored? Then the shocking twist: Caiaphas unleashed an angry mob upon Jesus, a decision seemingly devoid of reason or justice. The high priest, a man of God, sent a crowd to condemn and crucify a man who had only preached peace and love. How could this happen? Why was such violence sanctioned under the banner of authority? As we journey through the mysteries of Caiaphas's involvement in the trial and execution of Jesus, we'll begin to peel back the layers of this dark and intriguing story. What were the true motives of Caiaphas, and what consequences did his actions carry? The answers lie ahead, and they are far from what you might expect. Before we dive into the details of this haunting tale, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think Caiaphas made the decisions he did? Was he a man of faith, or simply a politician blinded by power? Leave a 777 in the comments if you're ready to uncover the shocking truths behind the high priest's actions. Stay tuned as we unravel the shocking mystery of Caiaphas's betrayal and the devastating impact it had on Jesus' fate. Let's begin. Caiaphas's horrible ending, the high priest who killed Jesus. In the dusty corridors of ancient Judea, where whispers of prophecy mingled with the clink of Roman armor, there emerged a man whose name would be etched forever into both sacred texts and the memories of countless generations. Joseph ben Caiaphas, more commonly known simply as Caiaphas, did not rise to prominence by accident. Born around 14 BC, he stepped into a world under the iron shadow of Rome, a time when the fate of nations could hinge on a single private conversation held behind palace walls. By the time Caiaphas reached maturity, Judea had become a delicate chessboard of competing powers. Can you imagine being born into a world where every breath of political wind could topple the very temple you worshipped? And into this tense landscape, Caiaphas was thrust, eventually ascending to the distinguished and perilous office of high priest. The historian Josephus records that it was in the 18th year after Christ's birth, under the authority of the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus, that Caiaphas was appointed. The previous high priest, Simon ben Ketlas, had been stripped of his sacred robes, a stark reminder that even spiritual leadership was vulnerable to the whims of foreign rule. How must it have felt for Caiaphas to accept the most revered religious position in Judea, knowing it came not solely from God's appointment through Levitical tradition, but by the decree of a Roman overlord? Did he tell himself it was all part of God's mysterious plan? Or did he sense the weight of compromise heavy upon his shoulders? The Bible teaches that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. Proverbs 21:1. Yet one has to wonder whose hand was truly steering Caiaphas's fate in those crucial days. Remarkably, Caiaphas's reign over the temple spanned nearly 2 decades, a feat unmatched by any other high priest named in the New Testament. This was no small accomplishment. In a volatile climate where Roman officials were quick to replace leaders who didn't serve their interests, his longevity pointed to a cunning understanding of both Jewish devotion and Roman expectation. Was it wisdom, political savvy, or perhaps a dangerous blend of both that secured his hold over the Sanhedrin for so long? Picture standing in the bustling courtyards of Jerusalem during one of the great feasts, catching sight of Caiaphas in his splendid priestly garments. Would you feel pride seeing your high priest uphold tradition? Or might you suspect the subtle strings of Rome tugging at the edge of his robe? Even today, we wrestle with similar tensions. Where does faithful leadership end and compromise with corrupt power begin? Caiaphas's story beckons us deeper into shadowed chambers of alliance and ambition, where sacred duty and political maneuver often shared the same table. But what exactly would this long and calculated tenure ultimately demand of him? And how far might one man go to keep both the favor of an empire and the semblance of holy authority intact? The answers linger just beyond the next turn in this story, waiting to unfold with all their haunting consequence. In unraveling this haunting chapter of ancient history, we come face to face with the pressing question that seems to echo through time: what truly compelled Caiaphas and the council of religious authorities to orchestrate the demise of Jesus of Nazareth beneath the surface of courtroom plots and secret bargains? Deeper spiritual forces were at work, yet on the human stage, motivations that blend fear. Pride and misunderstanding ignited the fatal chain of events. It's vital to remember that Jesus' journey to the cross was not an accident of history. It was a destiny foretold, woven into the very fabric of divine intention. Long before he ever walked the dusty roads of Galilee, it had been determined that he would lay down his life to redeem all of humanity. Still knowing that this was preordained does not lessen the tragedy of how it unfolded. Imagine being present when Jesus, fully aware of the agony ahead, spoke these chilling words, recorded in Mark 14:21. "The Son of Man will go, just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." What weight must have settled over those gathered, hearing such a pronouncement? This ominous statement wasn't merely a distant prophecy. It was a direct warning of betrayal's dire consequences. Yet strangely, those plotting against Jesus were blind to who he truly was. Even as they schemed, they failed to grasp that they were moving against the very Messiah their scriptures foretold. How often, even today, do people lash out at what they do not understand, mistaking holy transformation for a threat to their power or comfort? Caiaphas, at the helm of the Sanhedrin, was deeply unsettled by the undercurrents Jesus stirred among the people. Crowds flocked to hear this carpenter's son speak of a kingdom not of this world, and miracles seemed to trail in his wake. But here's a striking reality. Caiaphas and his council had never encountered Jesus personally as an adult. To them, he was a disruptive rumor, wrapped in dangerous influence, someone whose rising popularity could invite Rome's wrath upon the delicate balance they'd maintained. Picture the tension rippling through Jerusalem's temple courts. Rumors of Lazarus walking out of his tomb still fresh. Merchants recalling how Jesus had overturned tables, driving them out with cords. Would you, if placed in Caiaphas's position, have felt your authority slipping like sand between your fingers? Would you have feared Roman intervention more than divine intervention? In their desperation, the religious elite sought someone from Jesus' inner circle to confirm his identity. They needed a guide, someone close enough to point him out in the shadowed olive groves, where the crowds would not intervene. That's where the tragic figure of Judas Iscariot emerges. Though he walked beside Jesus, witnessed his compassion and power firsthand, Judas nursed hidden flaws that gnawed at his soul. Chief among them was an insatiable greed for money, a weakness the devil knew well how to exploit. But Judas's betrayal was not born solely from greed. It festered also from a profound misunderstanding. Like many Jews under Roman occupation, Judas dreamed of a militant Messiah who would shatter Rome's yoke with flashing swords. When Jesus spoke mysterious words, such as, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," Judas twisted them through his own longing for rebellion. Did he believe that by forcing a confrontation, he might spark the uprising he craved? Or did disappointment in Jesus' refusal to seize earthly power drive him to the brink? When Caiaphas's agents quietly approached, offering silver to secure their prey, Judas's tangled motives snapped into betrayal. With a kiss so bitter it would stain history forever, he marked Jesus for arrest. Can you imagine the sting of such a sign meant for intimacy turned into a weapon? The temple guards seized the moment, laying hands on Jesus and hauling him away under the cover of night, delivering him to Caiaphas's grand residence. Little did they grasp that they were not simply arresting a Galilean teacher. They were setting into motion the climax of a cosmic redemption story that would echo through eternity. And so the stage was set. The torches faded into the courtyard, the disciples scattered, and the halls of Caiaphas filled with hurried footsteps and whispered accusations. What would unfold behind those walls would not only alter the fate of those present, but ripple forward to touch every soul who would ever hear the name of Jesus. Who could have foreseen how far-reaching the consequences of these clandestine decisions would be, even reaching to us? Reading and reflecting millennia later, imagine for a moment the streets of Jerusalem cloaked in the hush of night lanterns flickering in doorways as families gathered to prepare for the sacred Passover. This was a time meant for solemn celebration, for recounting the mighty deliverance from Egypt, not for convening secret tribunals. Yet in a startling break from all expected custom, Jesus, just apprehended by temple guards in the Garden of Gethsemane, did not find himself escorted to the usual holding place within the temple complex, where prisoners typically awaited the formal assembly of the Sanhedrin. This was highly irregular. By every precedent in Jewish legal tradition, a man accused of a religious crime should have been detained there until the full council of 71 elders could be summoned to deliberate. It was a protocol even respected for the followers of Jesus after his resurrection. Consider how Peter and John, according to Acts 4:3, were arrested and kept in custody until the next day, so the Sanhedrin could gather. Later in Acts 5, the apostles faced similar treatment. Isn't it intriguing that the very leaders who upheld this practice with others chose to sidestep it entirely for Jesus? Instead, under the cloak of darkness, the guards led Jesus straight to the private residence of Joseph Caiaphas. Can you picture the silent procession threading through narrow streets? Torches casting long shadows on stone walls, the echo of hurried footsteps. What thoughts must have churned in Jesus' mind as he approached the high priest's grand home, knowing the prophecy of Isaiah 53:7, that like a lamb led to the slaughter, he would not open his mouth in protest. The decision to rush him there raised many an eyebrow, even among those who might have otherwise agreed with the high priest's intentions. First of all, it was the eve of Passover, a night when Jewish families gathered to recount their ancestors' salvation. The high priest himself was traditionally expected to be with his kin, overseeing rituals that bound the nation to its covenant history. How extraordinary that instead of fulfilling these sacred duties, Caiaphas chose to orchestrate a clandestine judicial ambush. Then consider the practical absurdity. Caiaphas's residence, undoubtedly impressive by local standards, could scarcely have accommodated the entire quorum of the Sanhedrin on such short notice. Where would 71 esteemed scholars and priests squeeze in for a solemn proceeding, particularly in the middle of the night? Could this gathering even claim the legitimacy of a formal trial without its full body present? It invites a question still haunting to ponder. Did those few who gathered truly seek justice, or were they driven by the urgency of preserving their power? Mark's gospel paints this nocturnal meeting with an air of secrecy and haste qualities echoed by Matthew, Luke, and John. Everything about it felt hidden, almost conspiratorial. Why the hurry? Why the darkness if the cause was righteous and the charges so sure does not? Proverbs 28:1 whisper to us, "The wicked flee though no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." Yet here we see men conducting solemn business in shadow, anxious to conclude matters before dawn might reveal too much. Adding to this web of intrigue is what John tells us, that before Jesus even reached Caiaphas, he was led to Annas. Annas, the powerful patriarch of the priestly dynasty and father-in-law to Caiaphas, was a former high priest himself, and though no longer officially in office, his influence over temple affairs remained vast. In John 18:13-24, we glimpse this preliminary interrogation, a quiet, almost probing attempt by Annas to size up this controversial rabbi who threatened to upend so much of their carefully balanced authority. Can you imagine being in that courtyard, pressing close to see your breath catching in your throat as Jesus was shuffled between these two towering figures of Jewish power? Would you sense the heavy hand of destiny at work? Or would it all appear merely as politics playing out its cruel games? Thus, with ritual conventions cast aside, Jesus stood alone under the flickering lamplight, surrounded by robed men who seemed determined to move swiftly outside the full gaze of the public and away from the checks of long-held tradition. They were not merely bending procedure. They were breaking it outright, eager to reach a verdict before the city awoke. What verdict they sought and how far they would go to secure it still waited to unfold in that tense, silent night. By the time these tense midnight proceedings unfolded, Caiaphas had worn the mantle of high priest for around 12 years, having succeeded his brother-in-law, Eleazar ben Ananus. This was a considerable stretch, given the volatile nature of Roman-occupied Judea, where high priests often came and went at the pleasure of the governor. His long tenure spoke volumes about his political acumen, yet even with that authority, Caiaphas found himself navigating a treacherous maze. Because here's the crucial complication: Caiaphas could not simply wave his hand and decree punishment upon Jesus. Despite his impressive robes and commanding presence, The power to officially condemn lay with the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of Jewish elders and scholars. This distinguished body served as the final arbiter on spiritual and communal disputes. If they refused to see eye to eye with Caiaphas, his hands would be tied. Imagine standing in his place, feeling your control waver because others might not share your urgency. Would frustration tighten like a vice around your chest? Caiaphas knew he might have one alternative. He could appeal to the Romans who maintained the final word on capital punishment. But that was a perilous path to tread. Historically, the Sanhedrin guarded their judicial autonomy fiercely. To summon Roman involvement would be tantamount to confessing that Jewish leadership could not govern its own religious affairs. Was Caiaphas prepared to risk appearing weak or incapable before both his people and his Roman overseers, and still another obstacle loomed? What precisely was Jesus guilty of under either Jewish or Roman law? His offenses amounted largely to stirring the crowds with unconventional teachings, upending the money changers in the temple, and perhaps making declarations about his unique relationship to God that unsettled the religious elite. These were incendiary to the priests, yes, but under Rome's heavy-handed legal system, they hardly warranted death. Could you picture Pontius Pilate taking such a case seriously if it lacked a clear threat to imperial stability? Caiaphas faced a delicate, almost impossible balancing act. He had to rally the Sanhedrin behind him or risk appearing divided in front of the Roman prefect, something that could invite more oppressive oversight. Yet he also needed to build a case that sounded serious enough to justify the gravest penalty of all. When the proceedings at Caiaphas's residence finally began, as narrated so strikingly by Mark, events quickly unraveled. The hearing was meant to be swift, a neat, decisive condemnation. But eyewitness testimony splintered almost immediately. Witness after witness stepped forward, each with slight variations that weakened their collective accusations. One said, "We heard him claim, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands.'" Mark 14:58. On the surface, these words seemed ominous, perhaps even threatening. But was it truly unique or criminal? The Hebrew prophets had long issued dire forecasts about the temple's fate. Jeremiah, centuries before, had spoken of the sanctuary's destruction, earning him scorn and arrest. Why should Jesus' words be treated differently? Could it be that in their desperation to convict Caiaphas and his circle clutched at familiar warnings from their own sacred tradition, twisting them into grounds for a charge? How often today do people grasp at fragments of speech or belief to condemn what they do not fully grasp, simply because it unsettles the fragile order they cling to? Meanwhile, consider the tense atmosphere inside that grand hall. Torches sputtered against the stone walls. Shadows danced like conspirators across the faces of stern elders. Outside, Jerusalem slept under a blanket of Passover anticipation, unaware that within Caiaphas's chambers, destiny's wheel was grinding forward. If you were among the curious onlookers pressed near the doors, would your heart race at the thought of witnessing prophecy collide with political scheming? Or would you shrink back uneasy at how quickly human judgment could pivot on shaky testimony and hidden fears? And so caught between the limits of his power, the reluctance of Roman authorities to meddle in purely religious disputes, and a fractured chorus of inconsistent witnesses, Caiaphas found himself pushed into a desperate corner. What desperate measures might he reach for next as the night wore on? And the pressure to secure a verdict grew almost unbearable. When the stumbling parade of conflicting testimonies failed to yield the clear-cut indictment Caiaphas had hoped for, the high priest chose to abandon the indirect approach altogether. Instead, he pivoted to a far more confrontational strategy, locking eyes with Jesus across the shadowed chamber. In that charged silence, Caiaphas unleashed the question that had lurked beneath every whispered accusation. Are you the Messiah? It was a perilous question, framed to corner Jesus into a declaration that could be twisted into sedition or blasphemy. Would you have felt your heart seize in your chest if you stood in that room, waiting to see how he might respond? Mark's Gospel captures the electrifying moment with haunting clarity. Jesus did not sidestep, did not veil his identity in another cryptic parable. He answered plainly, I am. Then, as if to leave no doubt, he reached back into the sacred scrolls, citing Psalm 110:1 and Daniel 7:13-14. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Imagine the stunned breath that must have rippled through the court. Those present would have immediately recognized these passages promises of divine enthronement and cosmic authority. Jesus was not merely claiming to be a local teacher with moral wisdom. He was identifying himself with the figure Daniel described, the one who would be granted everlasting dominion. Could you stand there without shivering, hearing a man calmly claim the very role foretold to preside beside God himself? For Caiaphas, this was both the ultimate threat and the perfect opportunity. He knew well that the occupying Romans cared little for subtle theological debates. However, phrases like the right hand of the power, alluding to divine rulership, and coming with the clouds of heaven, signaled a kingdom that might rival Caesar's. Even if the Romans scoffed at Jewish prophecy, they would not ignore talk that smelled of rebellion against imperial sovereignty. In a dramatic flourish, meant to seal the moment, Caiaphas tore his priestly robes, an outward sign of horror at blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? He declared, his voice thick with forced indignation. In his eyes, Jesus had handed them all they needed. The courtroom no longer required the fragile testimony of hesitant onlookers. This was a confession they could wield like a sword. But underneath the ritual gestures and righteous pronouncements lay deeper, darker motives that propelled Caiaphas and his council to such fervor, not simply to silence Jesus, but to ensure he met the most humiliating, agonizing fate possible: crucifixion. Why this grisly end, you might wonder? Why not imprisonment or banishment? Their reasons stacked up like stones around a tomb. First, the audacious claims Jesus made about himself, suggesting equality with God and authority over their entire spiritual system. Second, the astonishing deeds he performed, healings and exorcisms that undermined their religious prestige. Third, his mere presence threatened to unravel the carefully maintained fabric of their traditions. Fourth, he posed a real challenge to their social standing and the comfortable rhythms of their lives under Roman patronage. Fifth, he dared to eat and speak freely with tax collectors, prostitutes, and outcasts, shaming the elite by elevating the very people they marginalized. And finally, he seemed to trample their long-cherished rituals underfoot, speaking as if compassion weighed more than meticulous observance. When you gather these 6 grievances together, it's little surprise that outrage swelled into a deadly resolve. Do we not sometimes see the same dynamics at work today, where individuals or institutions will go to unthinkable lengths to protect power, privilege, or their idea of order, even if it means crushing the innocent? Thus, beneath the flickering lamplight of Caiaphas's hall, a verdict began to form, not solely built on evidence, but on layers of fear, jealousy, and threatened pride. In that charged night, they didn't just want Jesus silenced. They wanted him shamed, broken, lifted high on a Roman cross for all to scorn. The stage was now perilously close to its final somber act. Picture the air in Jerusalem growing tense, humming with rumors about the Galilean teacher who spoke of heaven as if it were his personal inheritance. When Jesus stood before the highest religious authorities and unflinchingly declared himself the Messiah, it was as if he set a torch to the fragile paper walls of their power. That single admission didn't just echo through the chambers, it struck at the very heart of the established order. To claim messiahship was to declare an authority surpassing even the most esteemed scribes, elders, and high priests. How could men so entrenched in their own influence accept a kingdom that wasn't built upon their own names? Their outrage was less about truth and more about threatened positions. As John records, the leaders spat their scorn with thinly veiled contempt. Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. John 7:48-49. Could you hear the sneer in their voices? To them, the common people were gullible, stumbling in ignorance, incapable of discerning spiritual weight without priestly interpretation. Yet, ironically, it was precisely this humble multitude that seemed most open to recognizing something divine stirring in Jesus. Jealousy is a poison that rarely admits its own presence. The religious elite might have framed their rejection as doctrinal purity or concern for tradition, but beneath their polished exteriors, envy coiled tighter with each new report of Jesus' miracles. Imagine watching crowds press around a man who held no official office, who wore no priestly garments, who had no temple credentials, yet whose very words and touch transformed lives instantly. Would you not feel your long-cultivated authority slip through your fingers like sand? The tension sharpened to a blade when Jesus' deeds backed his bold claims. One day, he encountered a man so wretchedly afflicted that most turned their faces away, blind, mute, and tormented by demons. Before the gathered masses, Jesus drove the darkness out, restored the man's speech, and opened his sight. The reaction was electric. Could this be the son of David the Messiah? Many marveled aloud their wonder, carrying the dangerous scent of messianic expectation. Matthew 12:23. This was too much for the Pharisees to stomach. Their hold on the people's spiritual imagination teetered on the edge of collapse. Desperate to reclaim authority, they lashed out with chilling audacity. This fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, they declared. Matthew 12:24. In a moment, they twisted divine compassion into diabolical conspiracy. Could anything be more tragic than watching men so blinded by fear of losing influence that they attributed the hand of God to the schemes of Satan? Think of what this reveals, not just about ancient religious politics, but about the human heart. How often does envy still warp noble minds, prompting people to demonize what they cannot control or understand? When someone rises with gifts that shine brighter than ours, do we celebrate or scheme? Do we accuse their goodness of harboring some hidden evil because it convicts us of our own inadequacies? In the minds of these rulers, each miraculous act by Jesus was no longer proof of heaven's kingdom breaking into earth, but rather evidence of a threat that needed to be extinguished. His power exposed their powerlessness. His authority, resting not on scrolls or human appointments, but on the very breath of God, overshadowed their carefully constructed reputations. And so, with hearts twisted by jealousy and pride, they found yet another reason to demand that this man from Nazareth be silenced forever. What they perhaps failed to see in that hour was that the more they raged against him, the more the story of this humble healer would grow until it would stretch far beyond the temple walls, whispered from one generation to the next, reaching even us today, still grappling with the question, what do we do when confronted with a truth that threatens to undo our comfortable illusions? Jesus did more than simply teach about love and forgiveness. He fearlessly laid bare the rottenness festering at the heart of the religious system of his day. By openly exposing the hypocrisy intertwined with their sacred practices, he became an undeniable threat to the very structure that underpinned the authority of the religious elite. The Gospels paint a vivid picture of this confrontation, most strikingly through two extraordinary incidents that unfolded right within the courts of the temple itself. The Bible tells us how near the time of Passover Jesus journeyed to Jerusalem and found the temple teeming not with prayer and holy awe, but with the noisy commerce of oxen, sheep, and doves. Coins clinked across wooden tables, deals were struck in hushed voices, and the sanctity of God's house was drowned beneath the din of business. Moved by a righteous zeal, Jesus fashioned a whip out of cords. Can you imagine the shock as he swept through those courts, driving out merchants and animals alike, scattering stacks of silver across the polished stones? Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business, he thundered, John 2:13-17. His disciples stood by, recalling the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house will consume me." What would you have felt standing there? Admiration, confusion, or perhaps a trembling sense that heaven itself had just broken in upon earthly corruption? These actions cut to the core of the leader's authority. For years, they had allowed, even profited, from the intertwining of worship and commerce. By purging the temple courts, Jesus not only challenged their spiritual credibility, but also disrupted the financial lifeblood that flowed through their institution. Was it any wonder their resentment deepened into something darker? Yet the threat Jesus posed wasn't confined to religious hypocrisy. The entire political atmosphere of Judea was charged with dangerous tension. Rome's iron grip lay heavy upon the land, breeding resentment and stoking dreams of liberation among the Jewish people. In such a climate, the very concept of a Messiah was volatile. Most Jews envisioned a mighty deliverer, a warrior king who would rally the masses, overthrow their foreign oppressors, and restore Israel's sovereignty. Their hopes blazed hot with visions of revolt. But Jesus confounded these militant expectations. Instead of rallying an armed rebellion, he preached a kingdom not of this world, a realm rooted in transformed hearts, rather than shifting national borders. His words lifted eyes heavenward when many longed to see swords drawn on Roman legions. Blessed are the peacemakers, he taught, not the warlords. Could you blame the crowds for feeling torn between their ancestral dreams of political freedom and this gentle rabbi's summons to lay down vengeance? For the religious leaders, this incongruity posed a twofold crisis. Spiritually, Jesus' teachings threatened to unravel the interpretations and customs by which they maintained power. Politically, his growing influence risked stirring the crowds into a fervor Rome might misread. The last thing Caiaphas, or the Sanhedrin, wanted was to give their occupiers any reason to tighten the noose further around Judea's neck. The leaders feared not only the loss of their religious dominance, but also the wrath of Roman authorities should rumors of a messianic movement spiral into rebellion. Any perceived instability could invite harsh crackdowns, perhaps the destruction of what little autonomy they still held. And so, with every parable Jesus told, every blind man given sight, every crowd that leaned in closer to catch his words, the ruler's anxiety escalated. Can you see how the delicate balance they clung to seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse? Thus, what began as spiritual opposition evolved into a matter of political survival. Their determination to eliminate Jesus was driven by more than envy. It was a desperate bid to preserve a precarious peace, a fear that his mere presence might topple everything they knew. Yet in clinging so tightly to their fragile order, did they not risk missing the very salvation they claimed to await? So the drama built layer upon layer, the fury of men whose power was exposed as hollow, the terror of losing a grip on a society already on Rome's watch list, and the irony that the one they feared might ignite insurrection was in truth calling them to a kingdom of far deeper peace. What they would decide next would not only shape their own future, but echo down to every generation that would one day read these sacred histories and perhaps pause to wonder what they might have done in the same fraught moment. The religious elite of Jesus' day clung tightly to a sprawling system of traditions, intricate laws layered over God's original commands built up over generations until they formed a fortress of human regulation. Chief among these was their rigorous observance of the Sabbath. For them, this sacred day became less a space for rest and renewal, and more a litmus test of meticulous rule-keeping. Every tiny action was scrutinized against countless man-made additions. It was within this rigid atmosphere that Jesus' ministry struck a particularly discordant note. Unlike these leaders, Jesus refused to elevate tradition above the true heartbeat of God's law. He seemed almost to delight in peeling back layers of ritual to reveal the compassion that lay beneath. One poignant moment came on a Sabbath when Jesus encountered a man whose hand was withered. Knowing full well that the eyes of the Pharisees were upon him, Jesus posed a question that sliced through their rule obsession like a blade. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? Mark 3:4. When silence met his challenge, he looked around at them with grief and righteous anger, then healed the man on the spot. Could you have stood by and watched this scene without feeling torn, admiring such mercy, yet perhaps fearful of defying long-established norms? This simple act of healing ignited a firestorm. To the religious rulers, it was nothing short of rebellion against the carefully maintained system. They had built one in which outward observance often overshadowed inward compassion. By choosing a human's need over rigid codes, Jesus demonstrated a profound truth: God's priorities are never confined by man's narrow rules. And that stung them to the core. But Jesus' challenges to their structures didn't end there. On another occasion, he spoke words that shook the very foundations of their religious identity. "Destroy this temple," he declared, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." John 2:19. Though he was speaking of his body, the true temple that would be resurrected, the leaders heard only a threat to their beloved sanctuary of stone. The temple was more than just a place of worship. It embodied centuries of Jewish heritage, the heart of sacrifice and ritual, the visible seal of their covenant with God. To suggest it could fall, and that he alone could rebuild it in 3 days, was to strike at the very roots of their authority and pride. How many in that crowd must have whispered to themselves, "Who does he think he is?" Time and again, Jesus' refusal to bend to their traditions, especially surrounding the Sabbath, exposed the hollowness of their spiritual leadership. His compassion laid bare their legalism. His bold statements revealed how much they revered their own power more than the living God. This was not just a theological disagreement. It was a direct threat to everything they had built their lives upon. When he spoke or acted, their comfortable order trembled. So it was that after Jesus was seized and brought before Caiaphas for questioning the matter came to a fateful head, when Caiaphas, likely with calculated hope that Jesus might incriminate himself, pressed him bluntly, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus answered with unwavering clarity, "I am." In that moment, all the unease, envy, and indignation boiling within these leaders found its justification. Now they could claim they were protecting their faith and traditions from blasphemy. Now they had what they needed. And so Caiaphas and those gathered with him, satisfied that Jesus' own words provided the pretext they sought, resolved to move forward. They would take this case beyond their own authority, straight to the Roman governor Pilate. For them, this was not merely about silencing a troublesome rabbi. It was about preserving their dominion, shielding their sacred systems, and maintaining the fragile peace under Rome's wary eye. As torches flared and plans took shape to escort Jesus to the imperial seat of judgment, one can't help but wonder, did any of them pause to question whether they were condemning not a heretic, but the very fulfillment of the prophecies they claimed to cherish? Or did fear and ambition drown out every last echo of conscience? Caiaphas, consumed by urgency, wasted little time once he and his fellow Jewish leaders secured the confession they needed from Jesus. Under the pale light of dawn, they hastened to deliver their prisoner to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. It was a calculated move born from necessity. Only Rome held the power to enact capital punishment. The religious council could censure, imprison, and beat, but to strip a man of life by law required the iron fist of imperial sanction. As they arrived at Pilate's residence, likely the lavish palace built by Herod the Great, now occupied seasonally by Rome's appointed overseers, the leaders laid out their case. They knew that purely religious disputes would not interest Pilate, so they framed their accusations carefully, highlighting a charge that would rattle any Roman official: that Jesus claimed to be King of the Jews. Such a title could easily be interpreted as a bid for political insurrection, a spark that might ignite revolt among a people already known for simmering unrest. Was it strategic brilliance on Caiaphas's part, or desperation clothed in cunning? Either way, it pushed Pilate into a position he could not ignore. Yet when Pilate himself examined Jesus, questioning him about these royal claims, he found nothing that struck him as criminal or dangerous. Here stood no wild-eyed zealot calling men to arms, no sword-wielding champion rallying legions to drive out Rome. Pilate, perhaps hoping to slip free from this troubling situation, seized on a jurisdictional loophole. Discovering that Jesus hailed from Galilee, he promptly dispatched him to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch ruling that region, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the festival. Herod, intrigued by the rumors swirling about Jesus, hoped to see a miracle performed for his amusement. But Jesus remained largely silent, refusing to cater to the curiosity of a puppet king, more interested in spectacle than truth. Finding no fault, Herod sent him back, draped mockingly in a splendid robe, a cruel parody of the very kingship he was accused of claiming. When Jesus stood once more before Pilate, the Roman governor felt the weight of conflicting pressures. On one hand, there was no tangible evidence to justify execution, certainly nothing Rome would typically deem worthy of the cross. On the other, a restless crowd was gathering its fervor, stoked by the chief priests. Could Pilate afford to risk a riot in a province already notorious for volatile outbursts? Was it political survival that finally tilted his judgment, or or an uneasy mixture of cowardice and weary pragmatism, Pilate tried once more to maneuver around responsibility. He offered what he believed was a reasonable compromise. Each year at Passover, it was customary to release a prisoner, a gesture meant to appease the local population, placing before them Jesus, the gentle teacher, now battered and bound, and Barabbas, a notorious rebel and murderer. Pilate asked which should go free. Perhaps he expected compassion or logic to prevail. But the chief priests moved quickly among the people, whispering, persuading inflaming old fears. Can you imagine standing there as the crowd roared, Barabbas? Did anyone hesitate, wrestling with a sickening sense that something holy was being trampled underfoot? And then louder still, the chilling demand, crucify him. Seeing that he could not quell the mob, Pilate performed a symbolic act that would echo through history. He called for water and washed his hands before them all, declaring himself innocent of this man's blood. But could water truly rinse guilt from a conscience? How often do people today perform hollow gestures to soothe themselves, even while allowing injustice to march forward unchecked? Reluctantly, Pilate handed Jesus over. Roman soldiers led him away to endure the agonizing procession through Jerusalem's winding streets to Golgotha, the place of the skull. There they nailed him to a wooden cross between two criminals, lifting him high, so all might gaze upon this grim spectacle. As hours passed, darkness fell across the land, an unsettling veil that mirrored the horror unfolding below. In these final moments, Jesus' voice rose above the murmurs of onlookers and the mockery of his executioners. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. He breathed, Luke 23:46. Then with one last exhale, the breath that had spoken worlds into existence fell silent. The earth itself seemed to shudder, as though creation recognized the gravity of what had just transpired. This was not merely the tragic end of a good man. In this brutal crucifixion lay the heart of Christian faith, a redemptive sacrifice offered so that sins might be forgiven, restoring broken humanity to its Creator. It is why Christians around the world mark Good Friday with somber reverence, mourning the cost of grace, only to rise days later in jubilant celebration of Easter, when death's grip would be shattered forever. And so, this story, at once heartbreaking and wondrous, continues to invite all who hear it to pause and ponder. If you had stood among that crowd, or within Pilate's marble halls, or at the foot of that blood-stained cross, what would you have chosen? The Bible itself does not furnish us with a precise count of days spanning from the moment Jesus was seized by the Pharisees to the hour he surrendered his spirit on the cross. It leaves the sequence suspended in a tapestry of vivid yet compact narratives, forcing us to piece together the timeline from the Gospels like devoted seekers, tracing sacred footsteps across ancient cobblestones. From the collective testimony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, most Christian traditions conclude that Jesus was arrested under the cloak of night on what is now called Maundy Thursday. Just hours earlier, he had gathered with his disciples in an upper room, sharing bread and wine, speaking words that still echo through churches around the world. This is my body given for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Luke chapter 2 in 19:20. Imagine sitting there, unaware how close darkness truly hovered, hearing such mysterious promises without grasping how literally they would be fulfilled within a single revolution of the sun. Later that same night, in the shadowed groves of Gethsemane, Jesus poured out his anguish in prayer, sweating drops of blood under the weight of what lay ahead. Then came the clatter of swords and the traitor's kiss. From there, events cascaded rapidly and arrest hasty trials before Annas and Caiaphas, then Pilate and Herod, the shouts of the crowd demanding Barabbas instead, and by Friday afternoon, the long ascent to Golgotha. In this compressed, breathless flurry, roughly a single day unfolded between betrayal and crucifixion. Have you ever considered how swiftly human hearts can swing from celebration to condemnation, from waving palm branches to raising fists for execution? Yet even this timeline is wrapped in layers of mystery. Different Christian traditions sometimes interpret the unfolding of these hours through slightly varied theological lenses, reflecting diverse understandings of how to harmonize the gospel accounts. Some emphasize the symbolic parallel to the Passover lamb, underscoring how Jesus' death perfectly fulfilled the feast he had just commemorated with his disciples. Others reflect on the weight of prophecy, noting how these swift events fulfilled centuries-old declarations with a chilling, intricate precision. Adding to this delicate uncertainty is the larger historical question: in what exact year did these sacred events occur? The scriptures anchor the story firmly in the governance of Pontius Pilate, who ruled Judea from roughly AD 26 to 36. Within this span, scholars generally estimate Jesus' crucifixion to have taken place somewhere between AD 30 and 33. But even with careful study of Roman records, astronomical data on Passover moons, and references from ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus, there remains no absolute consensus. Isn't it humbling that for all our calendars and chronicles, some of the most pivotal hours in human history refuse to be neatly boxed into a precise date? Perhaps there's a quiet lesson in this divine ambiguity. Instead of inviting us to fixate on pinning down an exact timeline, the Gospels compel us to enter the urgency and gravity of the story itself, these final days and hours where eternity broke into time. When we contemplate how quickly the Last Supper led to Gethsemane, how fast a night of prayer gave way to a morning of torture and an afternoon of atonement, we're reminded that God's greatest acts often unfold in startling, breathless swiftness. So, the next time Good Friday approaches and you hear the words, "It is finished," echo from the pulpit, or your own whispered reading pause to marvel. How could so much eternal weight be pressed into so short a span, less than 24 hours from betrayal's kiss to the final breath? What might that reveal about the urgency of redemption and the tender yet unstoppable determination of God to reclaim humanity? So now, we arrive at a haunting question that lingers like a shadow on history's stage. What became of Caiaphas after Jesus was crucified, after rumors of resurrection began to swirl through Jerusalem's narrow streets? The Gospels give us only glimpses, yet these glimpses are enough to paint a telling portrait of the high priest's desperate attempts to control a narrative spiraling beyond his grasp. According to the Gospel of Matthew, when the incredible report reached the ears of the chief priests and elders that the stone had rolled away and the tomb was empty, panic set in. The guards who had been stationed there under Roman authority came trembling with the news. Instead of pausing to consider whether something divine might truly be unfolding, these leaders immediately schemed to suppress it. Can you imagine how their hearts must have raced, not with awe, but with fear of losing their hard-won power? Matthew 28:11-15 records how they bribed the soldiers with a large sum of silver, instructing them to spread a fabricated story. Say his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. They commanded, promising to smooth over any repercussions with Pilate should the governor hear of the dereliction. Thus they wove a lie to try to smother the most astonishing miracle ever whispered on earth, that death itself had been shattered, that Jesus had indeed risen, just as he promised. Isn't it sobering to see how determined the human heart can be to cling to deception when truth threatens everything it knows? But history did not stand still for Caiaphas. As the years rolled on, tides of political favor shifted. Though the precise reasons remain murky in surviving records, it is known that Caiaphas was eventually stripped of his high priestly robes by Lucius Vitellius the Elder, the Roman legate of Syria. Some historians suggest it was part of Rome's frequent reshuffling of local authorities to keep ambitious rulers in check, while others hint that tensions stirred by the early Christian movement may have undermined his standing. Either way, the man who had once stood in judgment over the Son of God found himself removed from the very seat of power he had schemed so fiercely to protect. What must have passed through Caiaphas's mind in those later days? Did rumors of Jesus's followers spreading like wildfire across the Mediterranean ever reach his ears and haunt him in quiet hours? Did he hear how these disciples boldly proclaimed not just a teacher crucified, but a Savior resurrected, turning the world upside down in the very name he had tried to extinguish? Centuries later, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri would immortalize Caiaphas in his Inferno, casting him into the eighth circle of hell reserved for hypocrites. There, according to Dante's vision, Caiaphas lies crucified on the ground, condemned to have the weight of passing souls trample over him for eternity. A grim poetic justice for one who condemned another to be lifted upon a cross. Of course, this is literature, not scripture, yet it stirs the imagination to consider how earthly judgments may echo into eternity. Perhaps the greater lesson is not found merely in Caiaphas's fate, but in what it reveals about the perils of resisting truth when it stands right before us. How easy it is even now to bribe our own consciences with comfortable lies rather than face the uncomfortable reality of God's claims on our lives. When we hear stories of resurrection, of impossible forgiveness, of grace that demands transformation, do we meet them with trembling joy or with secret schemes to preserve the status quo? Caiaphas's story serves as a somber reminder that power, tradition, and fear can all blind us to the very salvation we most desperately need. And while the ancient high priest has long since vanished from earthly courts, the choice he faced remains timeless, waiting for each heart to answer anew when confronted by the risen Christ. Will we clutch tighter to our fragile illusions, or will we dare to bow in humble, life-changing awe? And so, we come to the end of this extraordinary journey, a story that began in the dim corridors of Jerusalem's power, wound its way through betrayal and unjust trials, and culminated on a rugged hill where heaven touched earth in the most scandalous display of love the world has ever seen. The tale of Caiaphas and Jesus is far more than an ancient record. It is a mirror quietly held up to each of us, daring us to see ourselves in its haunting reflections. Because when you strip away the centuries, the robes, and the Roman banners, you find human hearts not so different from ours today. Like Caiaphas, how often do we cling to our carefully built structures? Our pride, our plans, our fears of losing control so tightly that we fail to recognize the voice of God when it stands right before us. How easy it is to silence uncomfortable truths, to choose the safer lie simply because it allows us to maintain the illusion that we are in charge. Yet woven into this narrative is also the breathtaking grace of God, a God who was willing to endure betrayal, mockery, and the cruelty of a cross to open a way back to Him. Jesus' sacrifice was not just a moment in history. It was eternity breaking in offering us forgiveness, hope, and a love so relentless it could not be sealed by any tomb. To me, that's what makes this story resonate so deeply. It's not only about what Caiaphas did or failed to see, but what you and I will do with the truth of the resurrected Christ right now. Will we let our fears and ambitions keep us from embracing Him fully? Or will we allow His love to reshape our hearts, even if it means tearing down the comfortable systems we've built? So as you reflect on this powerful account, I invite you to pause for a moment. What areas of your life might still be resisting the tender yet uncompromising call of Jesus? Where might He be asking you to lay down pride, tradition, or fear and trust Him instead? If this message has touched you, I'd love for you to let me know. In the comments, share your thoughts, your questions, or even just drop a simple amen. It means more than you know. And it also helps this message reach others who might need it. If you haven't yet, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who could use a reminder of God's incredible grace. Thank you truly for spending these moments with me. May God bless you richly. May His truth set you free, and may you walk forward today with a heart more open, more courageous, and more tender to the voice of the one who gave everything for you.